Welcome students to exercise 42, which is on the reproductive system. So we're going to focus on the organs that allow us essentially to make more of us human beings. One of the things that is unique about the reproductive system is that it is not a continually functioning system. So this makes it kind of completely unlike every other organ system in the body. Right? Once your brain develops, pretty much it never shuts off. Once your heart develops, it never stops beating. But the reproductive system is different. It's not really active until we hit puberty in our teens. So there's a bunch of stuff that goes on in terms of the development of the reproductive system, kind of fetally. And if you were to look at kind of hormone levels of a fetus, particularly in males, versus like a child and an adult, they're different. But really, the reproductive systems themselves don't really become active until we hit puberty. So they're not kind of continuously functioning like the heart, the brain, the lungs, etc., etc. There are 4 tasks pretty much carried out by the reproductive system. The most important of these is, of course, the formation of our gametes, which are our kind of very specialized sex cells. They have half the number of chromosomes than the rest of our body cells. In males, the gametes are sperm. In females, the gametes are ova. Through sexual intercourse or copulation, the gametes combine, and then when the sperm fertilizes the ovum, we combine that genetic information, and the resultant structure is called a zygote. The zygote is then the kind of the earliest kind of embryonic stage in human development. Everything else, we all started off as zygotes. Everything else in terms of humanness started off as this little zygote. And then in females, the reproductive system is also responsible for the development of the fetus, so that's pregnancy and gestation, and then of course the birth of the baby, which is called parturition. And then of course there is some nourishment of said baby afterwards through lactation and breastfeeding. So the female reproductive system is slightly more complicated than the male reproductive system, just because it has more to do. So the structures and the organs of the different reproductive systems, males and females, are of course very, very different. However, they are considered homologous structures, meaning they have a common origin during development embryonically. And they carry out kind of some of the same functions with, again, of course, some additional things for the female structures. So, for example, the male penis, which is the copulatory organ for a male, and the female clitoris, they are the same structure embryonically. And then different hormones develop, sends them off on their different pathways, depending on whether you're male or female. So the organs of the different reproductive systems do share very common features. One of the things that they share in common is that they are regulated by something that we call the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. So the hypothalamus produces the gonadotropin releasing hormone that travels to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary then produces luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. That stimulates the testes and the ovaries, the gonads, to produce our different sex hormones. And then the sex hormones can go and kind of act on their target cells, which in some instances is actually the gonads themselves. So if we look at the gonads, the primary sex organs, we're talking about testes and ovaries. Testes in males, ovaries in females. The testes and the ovaries are what are responsible for producing the gametes as well as secreting our sex hormones, which are steroid-based hormones. So in males, these hormones are called androgens, so we're talking about primarily testosterone, and then in females, we're talking about estrogens and progesterone. So the primary sex organs of the reproductive system are the gonads. Pretty much everything else, all of the ducts, all of the different glands, all of the external genitalia, is all just kind of accessory organ. If we look at that HPG axis, when we are prepubescent, when we're in childhood, we have really, really low levels of sex hormones. But those low levels are still enough to actually inhibit the hypothalamus from releasing the gonadotropin-releasing hormone. And so it kind of just stops it all. We get no downstream hormones at all. We get no kind of cascade occurring. As we approach puberty, which is that stage in life when the reproductive organs will grow to their adult size and become functional, the hypothalamus becomes kind of less sensitive to that inhibition. And so those low levels of hormones kind of aren't enough to keep the hypothalamus turned off. And so the hypothalamus starts producing the gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which leads to the anterior pituitary to making follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which leads to the gonads making the sex hormones. As more sex hormones are made, that threshold for inhibition gets even higher and higher and higher, and so we get more and more and more active hypothalamic hormones, more and more luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, and of course more and more and more sex hormones. And this kind of pattern will continue until the kind of adult pattern of hormone processing is set up. And it's a little different in males and females. On females it's very cyclical, monthly, whereas males it's not quite as much. So let's look at the male reproductive system first. So of course we are talking about the testes as the primary organ. They sit in these little scrotal sacs, which carries the testes actually outside the body cavity. So they're part of the reason for that is that it cools them off, honestly. The testes exist at about 3 degrees Celsius less than your core body temperature. So if your core body temperature is about 37 degrees Celsius, your testes are about 34 degrees Celsius. And that's actually necessary for sperm to be produced. If the testes get too warm, then sperm production decreases and the sperm aren't as healthy and motile. What holds the scrotal sac in place is this muscle, kind of called the cremaster muscle, and it is responsible for that kind of shriveling of the testicles when the male gets cold. The blood supply to the testicles is through the testicular artery, which I think is in this diagram. Yes, there we go, testicular artery. It branches directly off of the abdominal aorta. Around each testicular artery is something that we call the pampiform plexus. It's all venous blood. That nerve plexus, or excuse me, not nerve plexus, that venous plexus will then merge with the testicular vein that drains the blood from the testes. But the really neat thing about this venous plexus, and the reason it surrounds the testicular artery, is it actually helps absorb some of the heat away from the testicular artery, which also helps to keep the testes cool so that they can make sperm. The structure kind of encasing the blood vessels as well as all the nerves and lymphatic vessels is called the spermatic cord. And so you can kind of see that here. And if we peel away the skin of the spermatic cord, you can then see that cremaster muscle. The testes themselves are kind of surrounded by two different sheets. There's an outer layer called the tunica vaginalis. It's essentially just the kind of peritoneum layer. And then there's an inner tunica albuginea, which is essentially kind of fibrous capsule that surrounds the testes. The testes themselves are divided into about 250 little lobules, and each lobule then contains anywhere between 1 and 4 seminiferous tubules, and it is these seminiferous tubules that are responsible for the sperm production. That is where sperm are made. Once the sperm are made, they travel through this kind of duct system into the reedy testes, and then on into the epididymis, which is this structure here. You can see the epididymis is broken into several different parts. This is the head of the epididymis. This is the body of the epididymis. And then this is the tail of the epididymis. The epididymis then connects to the ductus deferens, or the vas deferens. That leads into the ejaculatory duct, which then leads into the urethra, which then goes up through the penis and out the body. So if we look at the kind of accessory organs in the male reproductive system, we've got these two little seminal glands here. These secrete what we call seminal fluid, which is basically just kind of nourish fluid that helps to nourish the sperm. The prostate is this kind of walnut-shaped organ that sits around the urethra. It secretes a slightly acidic fluid that helps activate the sperm. So if you've ever known anybody with prostate cancer, it's the cancer of this little prostate gland. We also, at the base of the pelvis, have these little bulbourethral glands. They make a mucus that helps to lubricate the penis during arousal so that it's a little more slick for copulation. The copulatory organ for the male reproductive system is the penis. It's what we call the spongy urethra, surrounded by this essentially just erectile tissue that we call the corpora cavernosa. And then surrounding the urethra itself is this corpora spongiosum. So if we were to look at it in cross section, you can see here is actually the urethra. It is surrounded by these corpora spongiosum kind of tissue, helps to keep the urethra open, and then the erectile tissue of the corpora cavernosa. So if we follow our pathway previously, right, so the sperm gets made in the testes, into the epididymis, into the ductus deferens, into the ejaculatory duct, and then on into the urethra, and finally out the body. So let's look at that again from a different angle. So you can see, again, here is our testes sitting in our scrotal sac with a little epididymis on the outside. So the seminiferous tubules is where the testes the sperm gets made, into the epididymis, into the ductus deferens, into the ejaculatory duct, and then on into the urethra. You can see here is our seminal gland, here is our prostate gland, and here is one of our bulbourethral glands. So the male sexual response is actually a kind of combination of sympathetic and parasympathetic actions. So we're talking about autonomic nervous system. Of course, we have erection, which is the enlargement and the stiffening of the penis. So normally, when a male is not having an erection, the arterioles that lead to the penis are constricted, kind of slowing the blood flow. But when a man is aroused, that activates the parasympathetic nervous system, and that leads to this dilation of the arterioles. And so those erectile tissues in the corpora cavernosa essentially expand, and so that stops the blood from draining. And so we have that kind of engorgement happening because the blood can't drain from it. The urethra, since it's surrounded by the corpus spongiosum, kind of stays kind of untouched despite the engorgement of the penis itself. Now, ejaculation, which is the propulsion of the semen from that duct system, is caused by a spinal reflex activated by the sympathetic nervous system. The muscles and the accessory glands kind of contract. They secrete their contents kind of into the semen itself. The internal sphincter on the bladder will constrict so that we don't get any urine with the semen. One of the things that separates the male system from the female system is in the urethra carries both urine and sperm, whereas that's not the case in the female reproductive system. They're two separate ducts. And so the combination of the sperm from the seminiferous tubules plus all of the contents from all of the other glands is then ejaculated out through the copulatory organ. And your fun fact for the day, that can occur at up to 11 miles per hour. So those are some pretty fast little sperm there. The semen itself is a mixture of the sperm plus all the different accessory glands, secretions, the acidic fluid from the prostate, all of the seminal fluid from the seminal glands. Typically, anywhere between 2 to 5 milliliters of semen are ejaculated at one time, and they contain anywhere between 20 and 150 million sperm per milliliter. So we're talking about lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of sperm. Not only do we have all of those accessory gland secretions, we've got prostaglandins that decrease the viscosity of the cervical mucus, so it's actually easier for the sperm to swim up the cervix and reach the egg. It's got ATP, so that the sperm have energy. Semen is actually slightly antibacterial in nature, and it can actually suppress the female immune response so that the sperm are not rejected from the female organs. It's another kind of weird fun fact. If we look at the female reproductive system, their primary organ are the ovaries. So it is the ovaries that are responsible for producing the ova as well as the estrogen and progesterone. They contain what we call a follicle, which is essentially the oocyte, kind of baby egg, kind of stem cell egg, plus kind of the surrounding layers of it. The ovarian arteries off of the aorta are their main blood supply. Similar to the sperm, the testes, the ovaries are encased in a tunica albuginea, nice kind of fibrous tissue, and they are anchored in place by 3 different ligaments. We've got the ovarian ligament, which connects the ovary to the uterus. We've got this broad ligament, which connects the ovaries to kind of the lateral walls of the pelvis, and then this suspensory ligament, which connects the ovaries to the back posterior pelvic wall. So they're kind of held in place. So I mentioned the follicles in the previous slide. Follicular development is kind of a part of the female reproductive cycle. The follicles are what contain the ova, the eggs, and they come in various stages. So a primordial follicle is essentially really small. It's just a single layer of cells with a really small primary oocyte, kind of stem cell egg. And when a woman is born, she has all of the primordial follicles, actually, that she'll ever have. The primary follicle gets a little bigger. Now we get simple cuboidal cells around the oocyte, which itself is a little bit larger, and you get this kind of fluid space. It's full of proteins, helps kind of cushion the egg. It's called the zona pellucida. In a secondary follicle, we're now getting multiple layers on the outside of the zona pellucida, now stratified cuboidal as opposed to simple cuboidal. And as the secondary follicle kind of matures, the epithelial cells and some of the connective tissue cells will condense into something called the theca folliculi, and the theca folliculi cells are what are responsible for making some of the hormones in response to some of those gonadotropic hormones. The largest of the follicles are then these vesicular or antral follicles, and they're called an antral follicle because they have this antrum, which is this kind of fluid-filled cavity that forms between kind of the walls of the follicle as well and the oocyte itself. So the oocyte plus its kind of layer of cells, when it sits kind of off to the side on a stalk in the vesicular or antral follicle, is then called the corona radiata. If we look at the duct system in females, we're talking about the uterine tubes, or the, I can't even think what the older term, fallopian tubes, thank you. Couldn't think about that, what that was called there for a second. So it's the uterine tubes, the fallopian tubes that actually transport the oocytes away from the ovaries to the uterus. And the really kind of interesting thing that I think about the kind of uterine tubes is at the ends of them, they have these little finger-like projections called fimbriae. And so when a woman ovulates, when she releases an egg, the uterine tubes and the fimbriae essentially kind of have to catch the oocyte and get them going into then the uterine tubes. The uterus itself is then what retains and nourishes the fertilized ovum, if it is indeed fertilized, and then the vagina serves as the birth canal, the passageway for menstrual flow, as well as the organ of copulation for women. So the uterus is held in place somewhat similarly to the ovaries themselves. The broad ligaments help connect it to the lateral wall. The round ligaments help it connect it to the anterior wall of the pelvis. And then the uterosacral ligaments help connect it to the sacrum at the back. So again, it's kind of held in place. There are 3 sections to the uterus. The kind of upper portion is the fundus, the body is the bulk of it, and then the cervix is at the end. And that's what has to widen in order for the head of the fetus to pass out of the body. The uterine wall changes thickness during a woman's monthly cycle. It has 3 layers. The outer layer is called the perimetrium. It's essentially just the visceral peritoneum of the pelvic cavity. The middle myometrium, myo means muscle, of course is all smooth muscle then. That's what's responsible for the contractions that take place during labor and delivery. And then what you're looking at here, we're getting a little bit of the myometrium, but essentially what we're mostly looking at is what is known as the endometrium. And the endometrium actually has 2 layers, this basal layer and the functional layer. And it's really this functional layer that changes thickness as we move through the menstrual cycle, the uterine cycle, and it is this functional layer that is shed when a woman menstruates. If we look kind of at the system as a whole, you can see here is our ovary. Here is our uterus kind of held in place again with a lot of these ligaments. You can see here the fimbriae on the uterine tubes. So the fimbriae have to kind of catch the oocyte and then bring it into the uterine tubes, which is where fertilization takes place. And then if we look at our uterus for nourishing our fertilized ovum, so the fundus is this portion here. Most of the bulk of it is then the body, and then the cervix down here. Like I said, that's the part that has to kind of widen in order for the head of the fetus to fit out of the vagina here. And our 3 layers in our wall, the perimetrium, myometrium, and the endometrium. So yes, ovulation, fertilization, usually takes place with an egg here in the uterine tube. So the sperm, when they are ejaculated into the vagina, have to kind of travel all through this in order to get to the ova in the uterine tubes. So that 11 miles per hour is probably a pretty good thing. The other part of the female reproductive system, or at least that we usually study when we look at the female reproductive system, are the mammary glands. Now the interesting thing about mammary glands is that they're actually not reproductive. They're actually part of the integumentary system. They're actually modified sweat glands. Their function, of course, is to make and produce and secrete the milk that will nourish the growing baby. The breast itself is essentially just mostly adipose tissue, kind of surrounding all of these little lobules of modified sweat glands that make the nourishment for the newborn infant.